Hey guys, tonight we step into the early hours of an American city in the 1880s. The kind of morning that feels quieter than you expect, and somehow heavier too, as if the buildings themselves are still stretching after a long night. You're standing right there in it, the sky just beginning to pale from ink to charcoal, gaslights flickering like tired fireflies along the street. The air smells faintly of coal smoke, damp stone, and yesterday's horse traffic. Somewhere nearby, a bakery is already warm, and you can almost hear bread sighing as it cools. This is the Gilded Age, glittering on the surface, creaking underneath, and you're about to live two very ordinary hours inside it.
Fair warning, you probably won't survive this without developing a deep appreciation for indoor plumbing and modern deodorant. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always strangely comforting to know where in the world people are drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
You begin your day not with an alarm clock, but with the city itself deciding its time. A wagon rattles over cobblestones outside, iron rims clacking in a rhythm that feels older than patience. Somewhere, a rooster tries to be relevant in a place that no longer really needs him. The gas lights along the street are being turned off one by a lamplighter finishing his shift, even though electricity is beginning to creep into certain wealthy buildings. Most homes, though, still rely on gas, oil lamps, or simple daylight. Historians still argue whether urban Americans of this era slept more deeply because of darkness or more lightly because of noise, but you're awake now either way. You look around your room. It's modest, functional, and a little drafty. Wallpaper peels at the corners, its once bold pattern faded by coal dust and time. A narrow bed sits against the wall, mattress stuffed with horsehair that rustles when you move, like it's quietly judging you. This isn't a luxury suite, but it's also not the worst arrangement in the city, and that thought alone is oddly comforting. In 1880s America, overcrowding is common, especially in cities like New York and Chicago, where thousands arrive every week chasing work. The mainstream fact here, and it's a sobering one, is that urban populations are exploding faster than housing can keep up. You swing your feet to the floor, the wood cold and slightly uneven beneath your soles. As you stand, you hear the building come alive. Pipes knocking, someone coughing through a thin wall, a baby crying in the distance like a tiny siren that never learned mercy. You wash your face in a basin with water that feels aggressively awake. Indoor plumbing exists in the 1880s, but mostly for the wealthy. For everyone else, water is carried up, dumped out, and hoped to be clean enough. You splash your face and immediately miss the concept of temperature control. That's joke number one. And yes, you earn it this early. As you dry off, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a slightly warped mirror. Your reflection bends just enough to make you look like you're melting into the day, which honestly feels accurate. Clothing waits nearby, sturdy, layered, and designed more for durability than comfort. You dress slowly, button by button, fabric heavy and a little itchy. Fashion in the Gilded Age is elaborate, even for everyday wear, and getting dressed is an actual process. Historians still argue whether this constant layering contributed to better posture or simply chronic annoyance. Outside, the light grows stronger. Dawn in the city doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, filling alleys first, then climbing the brick walls until windows glow softly from within. You hear the low rumble of a steam engine somewhere near the rail yards, a reminder that industry never really sleeps. Railroads are the backbone of the Gilded Age economy, tying the country together with steel and schedules, and you feel their presence even if you never see the tracks. It's the sound of progress, or maybe just the sound of things getting louder forever. You pause at the window and look down at the street. A street sweeper is already at work, pushing debris toward the gutter with a broom that looks older than the Constitution. Horses wait patiently, steam rising from their backs in the cool morning air. One snorts, unimpressed by everything. Quirky tidbit for you. In the 1880s, some cities seriously debated whether horse manure posed a greater long-term threat to urban life than pollution from factories. It's comforting to know every era has its own version of "this is unsustainable," even if the specifics are aromatic. As the city wakes, you feel a strange mix of calm and tension. There is opportunity here. People believe that deeply, but also risk baked into every routine. Illness spreads quickly in crowded neighborhoods, and medical understanding is improving, but still limited. Germ theory is gaining acceptance, yet many people remain suspicious of it, preferring familiar explanations. Historians still argue whether public health reforms of the late 19th century were driven more by genuine concern or by fear of social unrest. Either way, you instinctively hold your breath when someone coughs nearby. You take a final moment to center yourself before stepping fully into the day. The sounds layer gently now. Footsteps, wheels, distant bells. The city feels like a living thing, stretching, clearing its throat, preparing to demand everything you have to give. You can't help but think, with mild sarcasm, that all this effort just to get to breakfast seems excessive. That's joke number 2, and the city does not laugh. Still, there's something soothing about this early hour, before the full crush of bodies and obligations, before the heat and the arguments and the endless transactions. The morning belongs to anyone awake enough to notice it. You inhale, exhale, and let the rhythm of the place settle into you. Somewhere behind you, a door opens. Somewhere ahead, the street waits. And just like that, your 2 hours in the Gilded Age have quietly begun. You move deeper into the morning, and the room around you becomes a workshop for daily survival. Everything here is designed for repetition. Wash, dress, straighten, prepare. The basin water you splashed on your face a moment ago now waits to be used again, because water is effort, not convenience. You rinse your hands carefully, trying not to think too hard about where that water came from or where it will go next. In many urban homes of the 1880s, wastewater simply drains into cesspools or the street, and the concept of a sealed sewer system is still unevenly applied. The mainstream historical fact is simple and unsettling. Modern sanitation is only partially in place, and morning cleanliness is as much ritual as reality. You reach for a bar of soap, rough-edged and faintly lye-scented. It doesn't lather the way modern soap does, but it makes a determined attempt. You scrub anyway, because the act itself feels reassuring. Cleanliness in this era is increasingly tied to morality and self-respect, especially in cities where reformers talk endlessly about hygiene and discipline. Historians still argue whether this push for cleanliness improved health more than it reinforced class judgment, but standing here, you're mostly focused on not dropping the soap into the basin. Joke number 1, this is not a relaxing start to your day. You dry your hands on a towel that's been used enough times to feel emotionally exhausted. Then you turn to the business of dressing properly. Yesterday's clothes won't do, not if you want to appear respectable. And respectability matters more than comfort ever will. Undergarments come first, layers that trap heat and restrict movement with quiet authority. You lace, button, and adjust, your fingers already working from muscle memory. Clothing in the Gilded Age is a social signal, broadcasting class, occupation, and ambition without a single word spoken. As you pull on your outer garments, you feel their weight settle onto your shoulders. Wool, cotton, maybe a blend that scratches just enough to remind you it exists. Tailoring has improved by the 1880s, thanks to industrial sewing machines, but mass-produced clothing is still a mixed blessing. It's cheaper and more available, yet often stiff and unforgiving. Quirky tidbit for you: some people believe wearing slightly uncomfortable clothing builds character, a theory that mysteriously survives well into the 21st century. Joke number 2 arrives quietly and refuses to leave. You check yourself once more in the mirror, smoothing a sleeve, adjusting a collar. Hair grooming follows. Water, a comb, maybe a dab of oil to keep things in place. Pomades are popular, and they smell faintly of flowers or herbs, a small luxury in a world of coal smoke. You take care with this step, because appearance affects opportunity. A neat look can mean the difference between being hired or ignored, trusted or dismissed. Historians still argue whether personal grooming truly opened doors or simply reinforced existing hierarchies, but the belief in its power is strong enough to shape your hands as they move. The room itself reflects these priorities. A chair stands near the wall, used for sitting, stacking clothes, and occasionally contemplating life. A small trunk holds your extra belongings, locked more out of habit than real security. Theft is common in crowded housing, but so is resignation. You glance at the door, solid but thin, and listen to the sounds beyond it. Someone nearby hums while getting dressed. Someone else argues softly, words muffled by plaster and distance. Morning rituals overlap, intersect, and repeat, a quiet choreography performed by hundreds of unseen neighbors. You step into a shared hallway or stairwell, depending on your building, and the air shifts. It's cooler here, carrying the scent of cooking fires beginning downstairs. In many homes, breakfast preparation starts early, especially if someone needs to leave for factory work at dawn. The mainstream fact here is that work schedules in the 1880s are long and rigid, often stretching 10 to 12 hours, leaving little room for leisurely mornings. That pressure seeps backward into these rituals, speeding them up, sharpening their edges. As you descend, you notice small domestic details. A child's shoe left near a step, a cracked window patched with cloth, a bucket waiting to be carried out. These are signs of adaptation, quiet proof that people make do with what they have. You pause briefly, hand on the banister, worn smooth by countless others doing the same. The wood feels almost warm, as if holding on to the memory of every morning it has witnessed. Downstairs, or perhaps in a shared kitchen space, the day truly begins. Someone stirs a pot, steam rising gently, carrying the smell of porridge or coffee substitute. Real coffee exists, of course, but it's expensive, and many households stretch it with chicory or grains. You're reminded that taste, like comfort, is often negotiable. Quirky tidbit: some people swear these substitutes are superior, which is either optimism or early evidence that nostalgia alters memory. Joke number 3 gently settles in. You reach for a cup, careful with its chipped edge. Breakfast is simple and functional, designed to fuel rather than delight. Bread, maybe yesterday's, softened with liquid. A bit of fat, if available. The act of eating is quick, efficient, and shared in companionable silence. There's comfort in this routine, even if the food itself doesn't inspire poetry. Historians still argue whether such diets were nutritionally adequate or merely sufficient to keep people moving, but the body adapts in its own stubborn way. As you finish, you rinse your cup and set it aside. There's no dishwasher waiting to rescue you, just more water, more effort. You dry your hands again, noticing how the day has fully claimed you now. Outside, the sounds are louder, more insistent. Inside, the rituals conclude, their purpose fulfilled. You've washed, dressed, eaten, and prepared yourself to be seen. Before stepping back out, you take one last breath in this semi-private space. It's a pause that feels earned. The morning has shaped you, wrapped you in layers of fabric and expectation, and sent you forward with quiet resolve. You're ready as anyone can be, to meet the street and whatever it decides to hand you next. You step out into the street, and the city meets you halfway, already in motion, already humming with a kind of organized impatience. Cobblestones press unevenly beneath your boots, each stone polished slightly by decades of hooves, wheels, and hurried footsteps. The air feels thicker now, carrying the layered scents of hay, manure, coal smoke, and fresh bread drifting from somewhere you can't quite see. It's a sensory collage that shouldn't work, yet somehow does. This is what a Gilded Age morning smells like, and your nose doesn't get a vote. Horse-drawn traffic dominates the street. Wagons loaded with goods creak forward,
drivers perched high and wrapped in coats that have seen better decades. Omnibuses roll past, their interiors already crowded with bodies swaying in practiced balance. The mainstream historical fact is that horses are the backbone of urban transportation in the 1880s, with tens of thousands working in a single large city. You give one a wide berth, because these animals are strong, tired, and not particularly invested in your personal safety. Joke number 1 arrives in the form of you realizing that "watch where you're going" has very literal consequences here. You walk carefully, timing your steps between wheels and hooves, learning the rhythm of the street as you go. Streetcars glide along metal tracks, pulled by horses or powered by cables beneath the road, depending on the neighborhood. These systems are marvels of engineering for their time, allowing people to live farther from work than ever before. Historians still argue whether streetcars improved quality of life or simply expanded the reach of long workdays, but for now, you're grateful they follow predictable paths. Steam makes its presence known in quieter ways too. You hear it hissing from a nearby factory, a sound like a giant exhaling. Industrial buildings loom over certain blocks, their brick facades darkened by soot. Tall smokestacks rise above them, thin plumes dissolving into the sky. It's progress, you're told, the engine of prosperity. Quirky tidbit: some early city dwellers believed breathing coal smoke could strengthen the lungs, a theory that ages about as well as milk in the sun. Joke number 2 politely clears its throat. You pass a cluster of workers heading in the opposite direction, lunch pails swinging, faces already set in expressions of endurance. Clothing here is practical: caps pulled low, sleeves rolled, boots scuffed and mended. There's an unspoken coordination in how people move, an instinctive negotiation of space that keeps collisions to a minimum. You feel yourself slipping into it, adjusting your pace, angling your shoulders, becoming part of the flow rather than an obstacle. The street itself is a patchwork of functions. Vendors set up early, arranging crates of produce or stacks of newspapers. Newsboys shout headlines with voices that seem impossibly loud for this hour, announcing strikes, scandals, and distant wars you might not fully understand. The mainstream fact is that newspapers are booming in the 1880s, fueled by rising literacy and cheaper printing. Historians still argue whether this flood of information empowered the public or overwhelmed it, but either way, it's hard to ignore when it's being yelled directly at your ears. You pause at a corner as traffic thickens, watching a police officer direct movement with gestures that suggest both authority and fatigue. Policing in this era is evolving, shifting from informal systems to more organized forces. The uniform itself carries weight, though enforcement remains inconsistent. You notice how people respond, some with deference, others with indifference, a few with open irritation. It's a reminder that order here is negotiated daily, not guaranteed. As you continue, you cross paths with a delivery boy darting between wagons, his agility impressive and mildly alarming. He carries parcels almost as big as his torso, moving with the confidence of someone who has learned the street's rules early. Quirky tidbit: many children work in cities during this period, contributing significantly to household income. Historians still argue whether this early responsibility built resilience or simply stole childhood. But watching him disappear into the crowd, you suspect the answer isn't simple. The sounds around you layer into something almost musical. Hooves clop, wheels grind, voices rise and fall. Somewhere, a bell rings to signal a streetcar's approach. Somewhere else, a factory whistle announces a shift change, its note long and commanding. You feel it vibrate in your chest, a reminder that time here is regulated by industry as much as by the sun. You adjust your coat as a breeze funnels down the street, carrying grit with it. Buildings rise close on either side now, their windows filled with curtains, signs, or the occasional curious face. Advertisements cling to walls, promising tonics, soaps, and miraculous cures. The mainstream fact is that consumer advertising explodes in the Gilded Age, shaping desires in ways that feel surprisingly modern.
You read one claim about restoring youthful vigor and quietly promise yourself not to buy anything involving elixirs. Joke number 3 nods approvingly.
At a crossing, you wait again, sharing the pause with strangers. No one speaks, yet there's a shared understanding of this brief stillness before motion resumes. You notice details you might otherwise miss, the pattern of bricks underfoot, the way sunlight catches on a window pane, the tired patience in a horse's eye. These moments feel almost intimate, like the city letting you see it breathe.
When you move on, your steps feel steadier. The initial chaos resolves into something navigable, even familiar. You're no longer just observing the street, you're participating in it. The rhythm carries you forward, past shops opening their doors, past workers disappearing into buildings, past the endless exchange of goods and labor that defines this era. By the time you reach the next block, the morning has fully asserted itself. The street is alive, not dramatically, but persistently, driven by necessity rather than excitement. You take it all in, knowing this is only the beginning of the day's movement, the foundation upon which everything else will rest. The city doesn't slow for anyone, but for a moment, it allows you to keep pace. You drift away from the busiest part of the street and into spaces where breakfast is either lingering or already forgotten, depending entirely on who you are and what you can afford. The city feeds itself unevenly, and you feel that truth almost immediately. On one corner, a cafe with polished windows and neat lettering offers warm rolls and real coffee to anyone with coins to spare. On the next block, a woman sells bread from a basket, her prices low enough to move stock quickly, her margins thinner than the slices she cuts. You slow your pace and notice how smell tells the story before sight does. Butter and sugar float gently from wealthier establishments, while the sharper scent of boiled grains and cheap fat hangs around more modest ones. Breakfast in the 1880s is not a unified experience. The mainstream historical fact is that class differences strongly shape diet during the Gilded Age, with wealthier Americans enjoying meat, eggs, and fresh dairy far more regularly than the working poor. Your stomach responds to all of it with equal enthusiasm, which feels unfair. You pass a window where a family sits at a sturdy table, steam rising from plates piled generously. Their clothing is clean, their movements unhurried. Breakfast here is social, a moment to read the paper, discuss plans, and linger just a little. Historians still argue whether such meals strengthened family bonds or merely reinforced social roles. But from the sidewalk, it looks comfortably deliberate. You remind yourself not to stare. Joke number 1 is you realizing envy pairs badly with hunger. A few steps later, the scene shifts. In a narrow alley, workers stand eating quickly from tin containers, leaning against brick walls still cool from the night. Their food is practical. Bread dipped in coffee, maybe a piece of salt pork if yesterday was a good day. Conversation is minimal, not out of rudeness but efficiency. Time is already rationed tightly, and breakfast must fit inside it. You notice how hands move fast, how eyes scan the street even while chewing. This is fuel, not ceremony. Street vendors thrive in this in-between space. You watch one ladle out bowls of thick porridge. His setup simple but effective. Coins exchange hands with practice speed. Quirky tidbit: oatmeal and similar grains become staples not because they're beloved, but because they're cheap, filling, and forgiving of poor storage. Historians still argue whether this reliance on grains contributed to nutritional deficiencies or simply reflected smart adaptation. Either way, the porridge does not apologize for itself. You consider buying a bowl, then notice how many others are already eating theirs while walking. Breakfast becomes mobile here, consumed in motion, swallowed between steps. You join the flow, chewing carefully, aware that cobblestones and distraction make poor dining companions. Joke number 2 arrives when you realize eating while walking is apparently not a modern invention, just a historically risky one. As you move on, you notice how children fit into this picture. Some eat alongside adults, clutching crusts or cups with serious expressions. Others are sent off with nothing more than a promise of food later. The mainstream fact is that childhood nutrition varies wildly during this era,
with long-term effects on health and growth. You see it in the way some kids dart energetically, while others move slowly, conserving energy like seasoned travelers.
In wealthier neighborhoods, breakfast takes on a different texture entirely. Delivery carts arrive with milk, eggs, and fresh produce, their contents checked carefully before being accepted. Milk, in particular, is a gamble in the 1880s. Pasteurization is known, but not universally practiced, and spoilage is common. Historians still argue whether fear of contaminated milk pushed reforms faster than concern for infants, but standing here, you understand why trust matters when breakfast can betray you.
Inside these homes, servants often prepare meals they won't eat themselves. You catch glimpses through open doors, aprons moving, hands working efficiently. Breakfast is staged upstairs, while the labor remains downstairs. Quirky tidbit: some servants reportedly developed detailed opinions about foods they rarely tasted, based entirely on preparation. Joke number 3 quietly acknowledges that cooking without eating is a special kind of discipline. You pass a bakery where yesterday's bread is discounted, a small mercy for those counting pennies. People queue calmly, knowing these loaves will stretch meals later in the day. The smell is comforting, grounding. Bread is the great equalizer here, crossing class lines, even if quality varies. The mainstream fact is that bread consumption remains high across all social groups, anchoring diets in a familiar constant.
As the morning advances, breakfast spaces empty and repurpose themselves. Tables are cleared, counters wiped, pots set aside. The city doesn't pause to digest, it simply transitions. You feel the energy shift from nourishment to labor, from preparation to production. Even those who skipped breakfast adjust, bodies adapting in quiet resilience. You glance back at the street, now fully alive, and realize how these small meals ripple outward. Energy gained or denied shapes the hours to come. A good breakfast might mean steadier hands, clearer thought. A poor one might mean fatigue arriving early and staying late. Historians still argue whether dietary differences directly influenced economic mobility, but you suspect they nudged lives in subtle, accumulating ways. With that thought settling in, you move forward again, stomach no longer empty, mind newly aware of how something as simple as breakfast can map the invisible boundaries of a city. The morning continues, carrying you with it, one block at a time. You feel the city subtly tighten its posture as work truly begins. The streets you just crossed now funnel people towards specific doors, gates, and stairwells, each one leading into a different version of the day. Factory whistles cut through the air again, less ceremonial this time, and more commanding, as if reminding everyone that lateness is not a personality trait worth exploring. You follow the flow, past brick buildings with tall windows already fogged by breath and steam. Inside a factory yard, motion becomes purposeful and repetitive. Workers file through entrances with practiced efficiency, lunch pails swinging like quiet metronomes. The mainstream historical fact settles in quickly. By the 1880s, industrial labor dominates urban employment, with factories producing textiles, machinery, food, and endless everyday goods at unprecedented scale. You notice how the building itself seems designed to swallow people, pulling them into its rhythm. You don't enter fully, but you linger near enough to feel it. The air vibrates with the low thunder of machines spinning up, belts snapping into motion, metal meeting metal with unwavering persistence. It's loud, but not chaotic. There's order here, strict and unyielding. Historians still argue whether factory discipline created efficiency or simply reshaped human behavior to suit machines. But standing here, you sense how easily the body learns to obey patterns. You drift away from the factory district toward office buildings rising nearby. These are newer structures, often taller, symbols of a different kind of work. Inside, clerks take their places at rows of desks, ledgers already open, pens aligned with almost military precision. The work here is quieter, but no less demanding. Numbers must balance, correspondence must be flawless, and mistakes linger longer than fatigue. You imagine the mental strain of copying figures hour after hour, knowing one slip could unravel a week's work. Joke number 1 quietly observes that spreadsheets did not make this job harder, they made it survivable.
In Countinghouses, money itself feels present, though rarely seen. Transactions happen through paper, ink, and trust, a system still evolving. The mainstream fact is that the Gilded Age sees explosive growth in finance and corporate organization, laying foundations for modern capitalism. You watch a clerk blot ink carefully, his concentration absolute, as if the ledger might bite if disrespected.
Managers and supervisors circulate through these spaces, posture straight, expressions neutral. Authority here is subtle but unmistakable. A raised eyebrow replaces a shouted command. You notice how workers respond instantly, adjusting pace or posture. Historians still argue whether this environment offered upward mobility or simply repackaged hierarchy in cleaner clothes, but the aspiration hangs in the air regardless.
Back outside, you pass workshops where skilled trades still hold ground against mechanization. A printer's shop hums with its own rhythm, presses clanking steadily as sheets stack up in neat piles. Apprentices move quickly, hands stained with ink, learning by doing rather than studying. Quirky tidbit: some printers develop such familiarity with typefaces that they can identify fonts by touch alone, an oddly intimate relationship with letters. Joke number 2 appreciates craftsmanship surviving spitefully well.
You pause near a construction site where iron beams are being hoisted into place. Men shout measurements, timing their movements carefully. Safety here is a suggestion rather than a rule, and you instinctively step back when a beam swings slightly off course. The mainstream fact is that workplace accidents are common in this era, prompting early labor movements to demand reforms. Historians still argue whether progress in safety came from moral awakening or economic necessity. But either way, risk is built into the day.
As the morning deepens, you notice how time fragments differently in each workplace. In factories, hours blur into mechanical continuity. In offices, minutes are counted, documented, and preserved. In shops, time bends around customers and tasks. You feel it in your own body, the way attention shifts depending on where you stand. Joke number 3 quietly notes that multitasking is still not encouraged, just unavoidable.
You pass a group of men gathered briefly outside a building, sharing quick words before heading inside. Labor talk surfaces here: wages, hours, rumors of strikes. The Gilded Age is not just about growth, it's about tension, about people negotiating their value in an expanding system. Historians still argue whether unions gain strength primarily through solidarity or circumstance, but the conversations feel earnest, edged with hope and caution. Inside a small office, you glimpse a woman at work, head bent over a typewriter. These machines are becoming more common, and with them, new opportunities, especially for women entering clerical roles. The mainstream fact is that the typewriter reshapes office labor, standardizing documents and subtly shifting gender dynamics. You hear the rhythmic tapping, faster than handwriting, and imagine the novelty of producing words at that speed. Quirky tidbit: early typewriters are sometimes advertised as tools that prevent bad handwriting, which feels like a personal attack on many people you know. As you continue walking, you feel the city settle into its working stride. Doors close behind workers. Windows reflect movement rather than invite it. The morning's openness narrows into focus. Even the street noise changes, becoming background rather than conversation. You take one last look around, absorbing the way labor defines space and time here. Each building contains a different tempo, yet together they form a single pulse. You step forward, carried by it, aware that this is only the beginning of the day's demands, and that the city expects you to keep up.
You slip away from the public rhythms of work and into spaces that hum more quietly, where labor doesn't announce itself with whistles or ledgers, but still fills every hour. Inside homes across the city, the day is already well underway, and you feel it in the steady, almost invisible movement of domestic work. Doors close gently. Windows open just enough. Somewhere, a broom begins its slow conversation with the floor.
You enter a modest house or apartment, the kind that looks calm only because so much effort goes into keeping it that way. The mainstream historical fact is that domestic labor in the 1880s is constant and demanding, often performed by women, children, or live-in servants, whose work is rarely acknowledged as real labor. Yet every surface here tells you otherwise. Dust gathers quickly in a city thick with soot, and keeping it at bay becomes a daily negotiation.
You watch hands move methodically. Bedding is shaken out the window, sending tiny clouds into the air that catch the light before drifting away. Mattresses are turned to prevent sagging, a task requiring both strength and patience. Historians still argue whether such routines improved health or simply created the illusion of control over urban filth. But the ritual persists because order feels necessary. In the kitchen, heat builds early. A stove is coaxed to life, fuel added carefully to maintain a steady flame. Cooking in this era is equal parts planning and improvisation. Ingredients must be stretched, leftovers repurposed, timing carefully managed. Quirky tidbit: many cooks develop an intuitive sense for temperature without thermometers, gauging heat by sound, smell, and the way air moves near the stove. Joke number 1 admires this skill, while admitting you'd probably burn water. You notice how cleaning happens alongside cooking, not after. Surfaces are wiped repeatedly, tools rinsed and reused, water is carried in, water is carried out. The physicality of it all stands out. This is not background activity, it's full-body work. The mainstream fact is that even middle-class households rely on significant unpaid or underpaid labor to function, a foundation often ignored in accounts of economic progress.
Children weave through these spaces, sometimes helping, sometimes simply existing in the way of everything. A child is sent to fetch coal, another to run an errand. Education is valued, but labor is often necessary. Historians still argue whether early participation in household work fostered responsibility or limited opportunity, but here it feels like a practical compromise rather than a philosophical choice.
In wealthier homes, domestic work becomes more formalized. You glimpse servants moving quietly, trained to be efficient and unobtrusive. Bells signal needs from other rooms, a system designed to maintain distance between those who live in a house and those who keep it running. The mainstream fact is that domestic service is one of the largest employers of women in the Gilded Age. You notice how skillful these workers are, anticipating needs before they're voiced. Quirky tidbit: some households maintain detailed rule books for servants, outlining everything from posture to acceptable conversation. Joke number 2 notes that workplace manuals have not in fact gotten less intense over time. Historians still argue whether such structure provided stability or enforced dehumanization, but the silence here suggests compliance has become second nature. Laundry waits in every household, a looming presence rather than a single task. You watch as clothes are sorted, soaked, scrubbed, and wrung out by hand. Steam rises, carrying the scent of soap and effort. This process can take an entire day, sometimes more, and must be repeated constantly. The mainstream fact is that laundry technology lags behind other innovations, keeping domestic labor physically taxing well into the late 19th century. You step back as a heavy pot is lifted, muscles straining, breath controlled. There's a quiet pride in this competence, in knowing how to manage a household against all odds. Historians still argue whether domestic expertise granted women power within the home or confined them there. But watching the work unfold, you sense both realities coexisting uncomfortably. As the morning progresses, tasks stack neatly atop one another. Floors are swept, dishes dried, clothing mended. Light shifts across the room, marking time more gently than factory whistles ever could. Joke number 3 arrives softly, noting that even in 1880, the to-do list never ends. It just lacks checkboxes. You notice small moments of rest stolen between duties. A pause at the window, a sip of water,
a shared glance that communicates exhaustion and understanding. These moments feel precious, brief interruptions in an otherwise relentless schedule. The mainstream fact is that domestic labor rarely comes with defined hours, bleeding into evenings and weekends without formal acknowledgement.
Before leaving, you take in the space one last time. Everything appears settled, orderly, prepared. It's easy to forget the labor behind that appearance, but you've seen it now, layer by layer. As you step back toward the street, you carry with you a deeper awareness of how much unseen work supports the visible world. The city continues its march forward, but inside these walls, another kind of endurance quietly holds everything together. You feel the tone of the city shift again as you wander into spaces designed not for producing goods, but for displaying them. The noise softens, replaced by a polite murmur of voices and the gentle echo of footsteps on polished floors. You've arrived at the new temples of consumption, shopping arcades and department stores, places that feel almost theatrical compared to the grit outside. Light filters in through tall windows or glass ceilings, bouncing off brass railings and freshly cleaned counters. The mainstream historical fact here is unmistakable. The 1880s marked the rise of the modern department store in America. These buildings gathered dozens of goods under one roof, transforming shopping from a task into an experience. You step inside and immediately notice how space itself is being used to persuade you. Aisles are wide, displays are abundant, and everything seems arranged to invite wandering rather than efficiency. You move slowly, letting yourself be carried along by curiosity. Fabrics drape elegantly, colors richer than anything you've seen on the street. Gloves, hats, and shoes sit in orderly rows, each pair suggesting a slightly improved version of yourself. Clerks stand nearby, attentive but not aggressive, trained to assist without hovering. Historians still argue whether this style of service empowered customers or subtly manipulated them, but you feel the pull regardless.
There's a novelty to browsing without immediate obligation. For many people, this is the first time shopping doesn't require bargaining or rushing. Fixed prices are becoming more common, replacing haggling with trust in the institution. You appreciate not having to negotiate over every item, though part of you suspects the store has already negotiated on its own behalf. Joke number 1 quietly notes that no haggling mostly means you lose politely. You pause at a counter displaying ready-made clothing. Mass production has reached fashion, allowing styles once reserved for the wealthy to trickle down at lower cost. The fit isn't perfect, but it's close enough for many. Quirky tidbit: some early department stores offer in-house tailoring to adjust garments, a compromise between bespoke luxury and factory speed. You imagine explaining modern sizing charts to these tailors and decide it's best left unexplored.
As you wander deeper, the sensory experience intensifies. Perfumes mingle in the air, competing gently for attention. Somewhere a piano plays softly, not because it's necessary, but because it feels right. The store wants you calm, comfortable, and just a little dazzled. Historians still argue whether these environments democratized luxury or simply repackaged desire. But standing here, you feel both welcomed and studied.
You notice who else is shopping. Middle-class women move confidently through the space, often unaccompanied, which feels quietly revolutionary. The mainstream fact is that department stores become socially acceptable public spaces for women, offering a rare blend of independence and safety. You watch conversations unfold, friends comparing fabrics, mothers instructing children to keep hands to themselves. The store becomes a social hub as much as a marketplace.
On an upper floor, you discover something even more surprising: rest areas. Chairs, sometimes entire lounges, invite shoppers to sit and recover. This is shopping as endurance sport, and the store knows it. Joke number 2 appreciates that even in the 1880s, retail recognizes the need for strategic resting. You sit briefly, absorbing the view of people moving below like a slow, purposeful current.
Arcades offer a slightly different flavor.
Narrower, often covered walkways connect small specialty shops, each one curated and distinctive. Light filters through glass above, creating patterns on the tiled floor. You feel sheltered from the street without being fully removed from it. Quirky tidbit: some arcades are designed specifically to encourage window shopping, even if you never intend to buy. The act of looking itself becomes valuable.
You stop at a display of imported goods, porcelain, fans, decorative items from distant places. Global trade feeds these shelves, shrinking the world into something you can hold. The mainstream fact is that American consumers in the Gilded Age gain unprecedented access to international products thanks to expanding trade networks. Historians still argue whether this fosters cultural appreciation or shallow fascination, but the appeal is undeniable.
Clerks keep careful watch, not just for theft, but for demeanor. Respectability matters here. You notice how clothing and posture influence the attention you receive. A well-dressed customer is approached quickly. Others are observed more cautiously. Joke number 3 notes that retail profiling apparently predates the barcode by several generations. As you make your way back toward the exit, you pass counters offering returns and exchanges, a policy still new enough to feel generous. The store wants your trust, your loyalty, your habit. You realize that these places are training people how to consume, how to desire, how to imagine improvement through purchase.
Stepping back outside, the street feels rougher by contrast, louder and less curated. Yet you carry something with you, a sense of how commerce is changing, becoming smoother, more immersive. The city doesn't just make things anymore, it invites you to want them. You adjust your pace, blending once more into the everyday flow, aware that the idea of shopping itself has quietly been rewritten around you.
You step back into the street with a new layer of noise wrapping itself around you, sharper now, more insistent. Words slice through the air before you even see their source. Extra! Extra! The call rises and falls, echoing off brick walls, impossible to ignore. Newsboys cluster at corners and intersections, waving papers with inky hands, their voices hoarse from repetition. The mainstream historical fact is that newspapers in the 1880s are the primary source of information for most Americans, shaping public opinion daily and dramatically. You pause near one boy who looks no older than 12, his cap pulled low, his stack of papers balanced expertly against his hip. He rattles off headlines like spells, compressing distant events into urgent sound bites. Strikes, scandals, speeches, all flattened into a few charged words. Historians still argue whether this style of journalism informed the public or inflamed it, but the effect is immediate. Even without buying a paper, you feel pulled into the current of shared awareness.
You take a paper and feel its texture, thin, slightly rough, smelling faintly of ink and damp. Printing technology has advanced enough to make these papers cheap and plentiful, and circulation numbers climb year after year. Quirky tidbit: some people use old newspapers as insulation or wrapping, giving yesterday's news a second, more practical life. Joke number 1 appreciates recycling before it had a name.
As you skim the page while walking, you notice how the layout guides your attention. Bold headlines grab first, followed by dense columns that require patience and good light. Illustrations appear occasionally, crude but effective. The mainstream fact is that literacy rates are rising during the Gilded Age, expanding the audience for print media. You realize how much power lives in these columns, quietly shaping what people discuss, fear, and hope for. Rumors move even faster than print. On the street, conversations sprout and dissolve as people exchange half-heard stories. Someone claims a factory is closing. Someone else insists a new invention will change everything. Historians still argue whether rumor culture filled gaps left by slow communication or simply amplified anxiety. But listening in, you sense both happening at once.
You stop near a group gathered around a man reading aloud from his paper. Not everyone can read, and even those who can sometimes prefer to listen. The reader's voice carries, steady and authoritative, turning text into performance. You notice how the crowd reacts,
murmurs of agreement, sharp inhales at certain phrases. The news becomes communal here, experienced together rather than privately.
The content itself is a mix of the grand and the trivial. National politics share space with local crimes, advertisements, and serialized fiction. The mainstream fact is that newspapers rely heavily on ads, which shape not only revenue, but content. You smile faintly at an advertisement promising miraculous cures, already familiar from earlier walls and windows. Joke number 2 quietly suggests that misinformation is, tragically, timeless.
As you walk on, you hear languages overlapping, English layered with accents and words from across the world. Immigrants bring their own newspapers, printed in familiar tongues, maintaining ties to homelands left behind. Quirky tidbit: some neighborhoods support multiple daily papers, catering to different ethnic communities. Historians still argue whether this fragmentation strengthens cultural identity or slows assimilation, but the diversity of voices feels undeniable.
You glance up at a bulletin board crowded with notices. Jobs offered, rooms to rent, lost items, upcoming meetings. This is another kind of news, hyper-local and immediate. People stop, read, tear off tabs. The city communicates with itself constantly, using paper as its nervous system. A sudden shout draws your attention. 2 men argue loudly over a headline, their disagreement animated but oddly restrained. Public debate is common, even encouraged, yet there are unspoken limits. You sense how politics here is both personal and performative. Historians still argue whether such street-level discourse strengthened democracy or hardened divisions, but you feel its energy regardless.
You fold the paper and tuck it under your arm, noticing how it marks you as informed, or at least interested. Carrying news is a subtle social signal. You pass others doing the same, pages peeking from pockets, corners fluttering. Joke number 3 notes that even without smartphones, people still find ways to look busy. As the morning advances, headlines change. New editions replace old ones, urgency refreshed. The news cycle is already spinning faster than it ever has before. You feel a faint fatigue at the thought of keeping up, yet also a pull toward knowing more. Information is becoming abundant, and attention is the new currency. You pause one last time, listening to a Newsboys call fade as you move away. The street absorbs the sound, blending it into the general hum. You realize that the city's stories are everywhere, layered into every conversation and choice. With that awareness settling in, you step forward, carrying not just the paper, but the shared weight of knowing what the day claims is important. You begin to notice a gentle thinning of urgency as the late morning settles in, especially in neighborhoods cushioned by money. The pace eases just enough to feel intentional. Doors close softly rather than urgently, and footsteps lose their sharp edge. This is the hour when work pauses for some and never truly begins for others. Leisure here is not loud or obvious. It's cultivated, arranged like furniture. You pass a townhouse where curtains are drawn back to let in light, revealing a parlor set carefully for use. Chairs are positioned just so, a table waiting for letters, tea, or quiet conversation. The mainstream historical fact is that the Gilded Age's upper and upper middle classes often structure their days around social rituals rather than fixed labor hours. Time becomes a resource to manage gracefully rather than endure. Inside, you imagine someone settling into a chair with correspondence. Letters are written deliberately, penmanship practiced and expressive. Ink flows slowly, words chosen with care. Historians still argue whether this culture of letter writing fostered deeper relationships or simply reinforced social networks, but the intimacy of the act feels undeniable. You smile faintly at the thought that replying later once took actual effort. A few doors down, a gentleman steps out, dressed impeccably, gloves adjusted, hat settled with precision. He walks without hurry, headed toward a club or cafe where others like him will gather. These clubs, private, exclusive, and heavily rule-bound, are hubs of leisure and influence. The mainstream fact is that social clubs play a significant role in shaping business and political alliances during this era. You watch him go, aware that important decisions are often made in rooms designed for comfort.
You wander past a public park where benches invite lingering. Well-dressed couples stroll along paths, their conversation low and unstrained. Children play under watchful eyes, laughter contained but genuine. Leisure here is supervised, orderly, and meant to reflect well on those enjoying it. Historians still argue whether such spaces democratized relaxation or subtly enforced behavioral norms, but the calm feels curated either way. Quirky tidbit: some parks enforce dress codes or behavioral rules so strict they feel more like salons than outdoor spaces. Joke number 1 gently observes that relaxing properly appears to require significant effort. You adjust your pace to match the slower rhythm, feeling your own shoulders loosen slightly. In cafes catering to the comfortable, tables fill with patrons sipping beverages chosen as much for image as taste. Conversation drifts from travel plans to investments to mild complaints about weather or politics. The mainstream fact is that coffee houses and cafes evolve into informal offices for the well-connected. You overhear fragments of discussion that hinted deals forming between sips. You pause near a newspaper stand again, noticing how different the interaction is here. Papers are selected thoughtfully, sometimes multiple at once, compared and discussed. Leisure allows for deeper engagement with information, not just consumption. Historians still argue whether this access created more informed citizens or simply reinforced elite perspectives, but the contrast with shouted headlines is striking. Music floats out from an open window, perhaps a piano being practiced, notes repeating patiently. Learning an instrument is considered an essential accomplishment in these circles, a marker of refinement. You imagine the hours spent mastering scales, the discipline disguised as pleasure. Quirky tidbit: some families schedule musical practice as rigorously as business appointments. Joke number 2 appreciates that hobbies, too, can become obligations. You pass a bookshop where customers browse without pressure, fingers tracing spines, eyes lingering on titles. Reading for pleasure is becoming more common among those with time and education. The mainstream fact is that literacy and leisure reading expand significantly in the late 19th century, especially among the middle class. You feel the quiet thrill of choice here, the luxury of selecting what to engage with rather than being assigned it. As you continue, you notice how leisure spaces subtly exclude without ever stating it outright. Prices, locations, customs, all act as filters. Historians still argue whether this segregation was intentional or incidental, but the effect is clear. Not everyone belongs everywhere, and knowing where to go is part of the privilege. You sit briefly on a bench, letting the calm wash over you. The city sounds soften, distant rather than pressing. For a moment, time feels generous. Joke number 3 notes that boredom here is considered a problem worth solving, which feels almost extravagant. Eventually, even leisure shifts. Appointments loom, lunches approach, obligations resurface. People rise, adjust clothing, and re-enter motion. The calm recedes, but doesn't vanish. It folds itself neatly away, ready to be retrieved later. You stand and move on, carrying with you the sense that for some, the Gilded Age offers not just wealth, but the ability to choose when to be unhurried. You leave the park and leisure spaces behind, returning to the edges of commerce and labor where the day is gaining momentum once more. Streets feel slightly warmer now, the sun climbing higher, and air smells of both baked bread and coal. Noise has returned in a more insistent form. Clattering carts, distant shouts from construction, the hum of machinery from factories tucked between blocks. You adjust your pace, knowing that the city operates in layers, each with its own rhythm, and right now, the industrious layer dominates. You pass a market, the stalls thick with produce, meat, and household goods. Shoppers move deliberately, exchanging coins for vegetables, eggs, or fresh-baked bread. The mainstream historical fact
is that urban markets remain central to food distribution in the 1880s, even as grocery stores begin to emerge in wealthier neighborhoods. You notice the careful calculations of both buyer and seller, the practiced movements that ensure nothing is wasted. Historians still argue whether markets preserved community ties or simply created new hierarchies within neighborhoods, but you sense both at once.
Vendors shout their wares, voices sharp, precise, and insistent. Apples, onions, cabbage, they all become rhythmic elements in the city's soundtrack. Quirky tidbit: some vendors practice clever tricks to catch attention, like tossing a melon or shouting in rhyme, techniques that feel surprisingly like early advertising. Joke number 1 observes that haggling here is less about price and more about stamina and persistence. You stop briefly at a butcher's stall. Meat is displayed carefully on boards or in shallow bins, often protected by wire screens to keep flies at bay. The mainstream fact is that refrigeration is still limited, and preservation relies on ice, salt, or consumption within a short period. You notice the meticulous attention to hygiene, though it's relative to contemporary understanding rather than modern standards. Historians still argue whether public concern over food safety genuinely reduced illness or primarily fueled consumer anxiety, but the care is noticeable.
Children dart between stalls, some carrying small errands for their families, others simply exploring. You watch one young boy balance a basket on his head while negotiating the path around carts and customers. Quirky tidbit: many children work or run errands in the market, sometimes earning small tips that supplement household income. Joke number 2 quietly notes that the survival training these kids receive is both impressive and slightly terrifying.
You continue past rows of shops offering textiles, haberdashery, and imported goods. Fabrics are bright, patterns intricate, displayed to invite touch as much as observation. Clerks stand nearby, ready to measure, cut, or wrap purchases. The mainstream fact is that urban consumers increasingly have access to a variety of domestic and imported textiles, reflecting both trade expansion and industrial production. Historians still argue whether this availability truly improved quality of life or primarily fueled desire, but the allure is palpable.
As you move along, the sounds shift subtly toward labor rather than commerce. Construction crews hammer and saw, scaffoldings groaning under weight, men calling measurements across beams. Safety is present but minimal by modern standards. You step carefully, watching the choreography of the work. Quirky tidbit: some crews develop silent signals for coordination, a mix of tradition and innovation passed down through apprenticeships. Joke number 3 murmurs that teamwork here is literal life or death, but everyone seems to have mastered it. Street traffic thickens again, a mixture of wagons, carts, pedestrians, and streetcars. You navigate with practiced attention, feeling almost part of the rhythm. The mainstream fact is that urban congestion is a real challenge, shaping street design, public policy, and daily behavior. Horses and vehicles require constant negotiation, and accidents, though not rare, are usually avoided by anticipation and courtesy. You pause at a corner to watch an ice vendor, a curious figure in an era before widespread refrigeration. Blocks of ice are delivered daily, stored in insulated boxes, and used for cooling beverages, preserving perishables, and sometimes soothing injuries. The mainstream fact is that ice trade is booming in cities, connecting rural lakes and rivers to urban kitchens. Historians still argue whether the ice industry fundamentally improved urban life or simply allowed wealthier households to extend luxury, but you can't help noticing its ingenuity. You notice small acts of human connection amid the commerce. A shopper exchanges a polite word with a vendor. A child hands coins to a mother or older sibling. These moments are brief, almost imperceptible, yet they give warmth to the otherwise transactional morning. Quirky tidbit: some markets maintain informal credit arrangements where trust rather than coin dictates exchange. The complexity of social trust balances delicately against necessity. Finally, you reach a quieter side street, slightly removed from the market's intensity. Here, you feel the city breathe differently. Deliveries continue, but at a softer tempo. The morning's full exertion begins to ease into a more sustainable rhythm. You step forward, carrying with you the layered impressions of food, labor, commerce, and subtle human interaction. The city's heartbeat is complex, but you've learned to sense it, moving with both awareness and ease. You drift away from the noisy thoroughfares and into quieter neighborhoods where life takes on a slower, more domestic cadence. Streets here are narrower, buildings lower, and the hum of commerce softens into the occasional murmur of conversation or the distant clang of a bell. The mainstream historical fact is that residential areas in the 1880s vary dramatically in density and condition, reflecting the uneven urban development of the Gilded Age. You feel a subtle shift as the city's tempo slows around you, and for a moment you can breathe more freely.
You notice how homes display themselves in this part of the city. Wooden frames, brick facades, and modest gardens signal effort without extravagance. Curtains flap gently in open windows, letting air circulate and carrying the sense of morning cooking. Historians still argue whether these outward appearances genuinely reflect comfort or simply social aspiration, but you can sense the pride embedded in small touches: a freshly swept stoop, a neatly trimmed shrub, a door painted just so.
Children play in alleys and courtyards, their laughter contained by brick walls and fences. Some chase hoops, others balance on curbs, moving with the light-footed energy of those not yet fully tasked with adult responsibilities. Quirky tidbit: the hoop, stick, and ball games of this era are precursors to modern playground traditions, though much less regulated and considerably more dangerous. You pause to watch one boy skillfully roll a hoop down the sidewalk, fingers brushing lightly against its metal rim, imagining how he learned that motion through endless repetition.
Laundry hangs between buildings, stretched across ropes from window to window. Clothes flutter in the breeze like silent banners of domestic life. The mainstream fact is that outdoor drying remains common, both practical and economical, long before the convenience of electric dryers. Historians still argue whether this exposure to the elements harmed clothing durability or merely encouraged efficient fabric use. But the visual rhythm of garments swaying in the air is undeniably comforting.
You step onto a narrow stoop, noticing how neighbors interact. Greetings are brief but warm, small nods exchanged as routines intersect. In some households, older children act as messengers, delivering small notes, packages, or instructions from one home to another. Quirky tidbit: these informal networks create a kind of neighborhood intelligence system, where gossip, announcements, and warnings travel faster than any official channel. Joke number 1 notes that efficiency here often beats the speed of modern text messages, though with far fewer emojis. Dogs wander freely, sometimes tethered, sometimes not. Their presence adds a chaotic softness to the neighborhood, and you notice how people step around or call them away. Animal care varies widely, and pets often serve multiple purposes: companionship, guard duty, and minor labor assistance. The mainstream fact is that urban animal management is complex during this period, as populations swell and municipal regulations are still forming. Historians still argue whether the reliance on animals shaped city planning more than people realize, but their influence is everywhere. You pause at a small corner shop where bread, milk, and basic goods are sold. The shopkeeper nods to each customer individually, a rhythm of acknowledgement that creates connection as well as transaction. Quirky tidbit: some proprietors maintain informal credit records for regular clients, essentially functioning as tiny local banks. Joke number 2 quietly observes that trust and math coexisting in a ledger is surprisingly timeless.
The sounds of domestic life emerge more clearly here. Water drawn from wells or pumps, the creak of floorboards as someone moves within, the occasional hiss of steam from a cooking pot. These small auditory cues mark time in a world without clocks for everyone, creating an ambient rhythm that residents subconsciously follow. The mainstream fact is that timekeeping in the 1880s varies. Not everyone has access to personal clocks, so bells, whistles, and human activity provide temporal structure.
Historians still argue whether this reliance on environmental cues strengthened community cohesion or introduced inefficiency, but either way, it shapes behavior subtly yet consistently.
You notice food preparation occurring through open windows or doorways. A woman kneads dough, its elasticity and motion hypnotic. Children occasionally peer over her shoulder, learning by observation. The act is tactile, deliberate, a quiet education in domestic management. Quirky tidbit: some households create informal competitions for cooking speed or quality, turning mundane tasks into games. Joke number 3 smiles at the idea that even bread making can come with competitive tension. Laundry baskets are moved indoors and outdoors in careful rotations, reflecting weather and household priorities. You watch as a neighbor carefully folds garments, stacking them according to type and family member. The mainstream fact is that domestic organization is a skill honed by necessity, as household survival depends on repeated attention to detail. Historians still argue whether this labor empowers those performing it or confines them, but you can feel the expertise in every motion.
You pass a schoolhouse, its bell calling students to lessons. Children enter briskly, books clutched, faces attentive. Education is expanding, increasingly valued even in working-class neighborhoods. The mainstream fact is that public schooling grows during this era, offering literacy and numeracy to a wider population than ever before. Historians still debate whether schools fully leveled the playing field or reinforced social stratification, but the sight of focused students brings a quiet satisfaction. Finally, you reach a small courtyard where families gather for a brief respite. Someone tends a flower patch, another child chases a hoop. Steam rises from a cooking pot inside an open doorway. The neighborhood breathes as a single organism, each part sustaining the others, each routine linked invisibly to the next. You pause and feel the continuity, the steady rhythm of domestic life carrying the city forward while remaining quietly separate from its industrial pulse. You leave the quieter residential streets behind and move toward the fringes of the city, where industry hums with a more methodical, less chaotic energy. Here, warehouses and small factories sit side by side with shops and tenements, creating a landscape that feels part work, part neighborhood, and entirely alive. The air smells faintly of oil, dust, and distant coal smoke, a subtle reminder that production never truly pauses. The mainstream historical fact is that mixed-use districts are common in Gilded Age cities, where commercial, industrial, and residential spaces often share the same blocks. You notice how people navigate this blend with practiced attention.
You walk past a tannery where hides hang in neat rows, their surfaces slick and pungent. Workers bend over vats with steady precision, treating animal skins in ways that transform raw material into leather. Historians still argue whether such industrial work improved livelihoods or imposed harsh, unavoidable health risks, but watching their rhythm, you see mastery in motion. Quirky tidbit: some tanners claim that working closely with hides gives an almost tactile sense of history, smelling centuries-old techniques in every batch. Joke number 1 murmurs that the smell probably counts as a romantic experience.
Further down the street, a carriage maker's shop shows artisans assembling wheels, suspensions, and leather harnesses. Hands are calloused but skilled, the work precise and quietly celebrated within the craft. The mainstream fact is that artisan trades persist alongside mechanization, preserving techniques and small-scale knowledge even as mass production expands. You feel the contrast between factory uniformity and bespoke craft, a tension historians still debate regarding its influence on modern industry. You pause at a blacksmith's forge, heat radiating from open doors. Hammers strike rhythmically, sending sparks into the air like tiny, obedient fireflies. The blacksmith's apprentice moves with surprising agility, carrying tools and metal pieces without faltering. Quirky tidbit: apprentices often develop calluses in highly specific patterns, which local lore suggests can identify skill level at a glance. Joke number 2 notes that perhaps modern handshakes should include callus inspection for authenticity.
A nearby iron foundry sends low vibrations through the street. Molten metal glows faintly behind thick windows, furnaces breathing heat and occasional smoke. Workers in heavy leather aprons manipulate the flow with care, timing each movement like a slow, dangerous dance. The mainstream fact is that metal production is critical to urban growth, feeding transportation, construction, and machinery. Historians still argue whether the speed and scale of these operations sacrificed safety for output, but you sense that precision and vigilance are everywhere present.
You notice how people move between these industrial sites. Laborers often traverse long distances on foot, their pace deliberate yet efficient. Public transportation, where available, is used sparingly for these short trips, as wages make frequent use difficult. Quirky tidbit, some workers memorize shortcuts and alleys known only to locals, a citywide knowledge passed through apprenticeship rather than maps. Joke number 3 quietly admires these invisible urban networks.
Street vendors appear again, offering food and drink to sustain laborers in these districts. Coffee, pies, and simple sandwiches are consumed quickly, often while standing or walking. The mainstream fact is that informal street economies flourish wherever official workplaces cluster. Historians still argue whether such vendors were essential community support or informal nuisances, but you notice how they knit together daily routines across multiple workplaces.
Children appear less frequently here, but those who do move with caution, often shadowing older siblings or parents. Education is intermittent, work demands pressing. Quirky tidbit, some children deliver messages or carry small tools, effectively learning the trade before formal apprenticeship begins. You feel the subtle layering of labor across generations, skills and habits passed quietly rather than formally taught.
The architecture itself reflects purpose. Large windows, heavy doors, reinforced floors, all signal function over form. You notice the weight of brick and timber, the way buildings absorb and redirect noise. The mainstream fact is that industrial design balances structural integrity with operational efficiency, a consideration historians still argue shaped urban expansion. Observing the scale, you appreciate the silent negotiation between human effort and material limits.
You pause near a shipment dock, watching crates loaded onto wagons for distribution. Each box is marked carefully, handled with diligence, and stacked according to both size and fragility. Workers communicate with gestures more than words, a subtle language of coordination. Quirky tidbit, some longshoremen develop signals that only insiders understand, blending efficiency with playful secrecy. Joke number 4 whispers that this is like a secret club for adults who lift heavy boxes.
Finally, you step back to observe the district as a whole. Smoke rises, wheels turn, hammers strike, and voices call. Yet beneath the apparent chaos is a hidden order, a balance maintained by experience, habit, and necessity. You sense that the city's backbone, its production and craft, is quieter than the markets or leisure districts, but no less essential. The mainstream fact is that industrial labor drives urban economies, supporting commerce, households, and the ambitions of the Gilded Age. Historians still argue whether such labor disproportionately benefits owners or workers, but its presence shapes every block you traverse.
As you continue walking, the soundscape changes subtly, moving from the roar of machinery to the lighter percussion of footsteps, distant conversations, and wagons rolling along cobblestones. You carry the weight of understanding with you. Cities are made of layered motion, some visible, some hidden, all connected through effort and attention. Your steps align with the rhythm of the district, and you feel both small and in tune, part of a larger, moving organism.
You drift toward the edges of the city, where entertainment and public spectacle quietly assert their presence. Here, the hum of labor softens into music, laughter, and occasional applause, blending with the distant clatter of traffic rather than competing against it. The mainstream historical fact is that the Gilded Age sees the rise of urban amusements,
from theaters and vaudeville halls to circuses and public parks designed for leisure, offering citizens respite from the rigor of work. You notice the subtle way these spaces invite attention, not through force, but through the promise of curiosity fulfilled. You pass a small theater with posters plastered across its doors and windows, announcing upcoming performances. Actors' faces are painted brightly, scenes from plays suggested in bold lettering. Historians still argue whether theater during this era primarily reflected popular taste or shaped it, but the very presence of the posters hints at a city conscious of its cultural appetite. Quirky tidbit: some theaters employ poster artists whose fame rivals minor actors, known for their ability to capture drama in a few vivid strokes. Joke number 1 notes that advertising hasn't really changed, still exaggerated, still captivating.
Inside, a clerk arranges tickets behind a counter, methodically checking reservations against a ledger. Patrons mill about outside, conversation gentle but expectant. The mainstream fact is that theater attendance spans a broad social spectrum, from working-class families attending matinees to the affluent reserving boxes. You observe the subtle hierarchy in seating, the way spaces within the theater signal status as much as the performance itself. Historians still argue whether accessibility democratized culture or reinforced existing class divisions, but you feel both forces in tension. As you continue, you hear music drifting from a nearby park, carried on a soft breeze. Bands play light orchestral pieces, occasionally interrupted by the laughter of children chasing hoops or balloons. Quirky tidbit: municipal bandstands flourish in many cities, providing entertainment free or at low cost, while subtly promoting civic pride. Joke number 2 winks at the idea that even free concerts are somehow still carefully managed performances.
A few steps farther, you notice a vaudeville hall, its marquee glowing faintly in the morning light. Performers rehearse lines, practice acrobatics, and warm up instruments behind curtained windows. The mainstream fact is that vaudeville offers variety entertainment, blending comedy, music, and novelty acts, appealing to a diverse audience. Historians still debate whether vaudeville reflects authentic popular culture or commodifies it, but standing nearby, you can almost hear the energy of the shows preparing to begin.
Street performers appear as well, their acts more ephemeral than formal theater, but no less demanding. A juggler balances pins with careful precision, while a magician works simple illusions on a small crowd. Quirky tidbit: some performers invent tricks in response to audience reaction, creating a dynamic dialogue rather than scripted routine. Joke number 3 observes that the oldest tricks remain surprisingly effective, even as audiences grow jaded elsewhere.
You wander toward a public park that serves multiple purposes. Gardens, walking paths, and entertainment spaces intermingle. Families picnic quietly, reading or napping on the grass. Vendors offer refreshments, from lemonade to pastries. Their calls a gentle rhythm rather than clamor. The mainstream fact is that public parks reflect both municipal pride and social engineering, designed to encourage moral, orderly recreation. Historians still argue whether parks genuinely improve urban life or subtly guide behavior, but you feel the peace they offer, regardless. Children chase each other around fountains, their squeals punctuating the soft music of the bandstand. Adults lean against benches, reading papers or simply observing. You notice how design, timing, and social expectation merge to create a shared experience. Quirky tidbit: some fountains are engineered to create subtle soundscapes, with water flow carefully calculated to mask street noise. You marvel at this unnoticed orchestration.
A carousel creaks faintly in the distance, wooden horses rocking in gentle rhythm. The mainstream fact is that amusement rides gain popularity in urban parks during this era, reflecting fascination with mechanization and spectacle. Historians still debate whether rides promote communal joy or cater primarily to consumer distraction, but you watch the steady rotation, noting how rhythm and motion draw people effortlessly.
Nearby, a small crowd gathers for a storyteller, words carried clearly even through murmuring spectators.
Oral storytelling persists alongside print, offering narrative in motion. Quirky tidbit: some storytellers memorize extensive sequences of local legends, performing them with subtle gestures that make each tale unique. Joke number 4 notes that even in a city overflowing with newsprint, a voice can still command attention in ways paper cannot.
You pause to take in the scene as a whole. The streets, the performers, the small theaters, and the park together create a layered texture of human experience. Entertainment here is subtle yet pervasive, shaping the day's rhythm without insisting on focus or immediacy. You feel the city's pulse relax in response to these spaces, a deliberate counterpoint to labor and commerce. The mainstream fact is that amusement, culture, and leisure occupy a structured yet fluid part of urban life, providing necessary contrast to work and domesticity. Historians still argue whether this balance succeeds or simply masks deeper inequalities, but you sense the value of intentional pause.
With a deep breath, you continue walking, carrying the faint echo of music, laughter, and applause. The day's activity now feels layered: work and domestic duty, markets and shops, entertainment and social ritual, interwoven in complex harmony. The Gilded Age reveals itself not merely in labor or wealth, but in the quiet choreography of how people fill hours with both necessity and delight.
You drift back toward the city streets as afternoon stretches lazily into early evening. The sun angles lower, casting long shadows across cobblestones, and the air grows warmer with lingering heat from buildings, pavement, and machinery. You notice the ebb and flow of traffic shift once again. Delivery wagons roll more slowly, shoppers move with less urgency, and workers emerging from factories carry the day's labor in posture and pace. The mainstream historical fact is that urban life in the Gilded Age operates on cycles, with energy surging and receding as sunlight dictates work and leisure. You feel the rhythm settle into something more gentle, yet still purposeful. You pass a brewery where men and women move quietly through the interior, barrels being rolled with precise coordination. The scent of malt and yeast drifts into the street, almost intoxicating in its familiarity. Historians still argue whether beer culture strengthens social cohesion or reinforces alcohol dependency, but the scene before you feels like ordinary daily life rather than excess. Quirky tidbit: some breweries employ beer tasters whose palates must be trained to detect subtle flavor variations, a profession both revered and quietly dangerous. Joke number 1 whispers that tasting for a living might be the dream job of some and the slowest headache for others. As you continue, you notice families gathering in front of modest homes, children chasing hoops or playing simple tag games. Women hang laundry for a final airing before dusk, and men return from errands or short work shifts. The mainstream fact is that evening routines are carefully orchestrated, particularly in working-class households, blending necessity with fleeting leisure. Historians still argue whether these rhythms allow for genuine relaxation or simply extend the reach of domestic labor, but you sense both effects in the motions around you. You pause at a corner where a small fruit stand still operates, offering the last oranges, apples, or peaches of the day. The vendor's call is subdued compared to the morning's performance, yet it still carries a hint of charm. Quirky tidbit: some vendors offer tiny samples to encourage purchase, a technique as old as trade itself. Joke number 2 observes that clever persuasion hasn't really changed, just the currency and the packaging. In residential lanes, shadows grow longer, softening the outlines of buildings. Streetlights, gas-powered in most districts, begin to flicker to life. You notice how light and shadow shape perception, creating safe pockets and obscured corners. The mainstream fact is that artificial lighting is becoming more common, altering both social activity and urban crime patterns. Historians still debate whether street illumination primarily improves safety or simply extends productive hours, but you sense that its presence subtly reshapes the city's rhythm. You walk past a schoolhouse where children exit slowly, some escorted by parents, others wandering independently.
Their laughter and chatter form a quiet counterpoint to the city's ongoing pulse. Quirky tidbit: many schools stagger dismissal times to reduce crowding, an early example of urban scheduling designed for efficiency and safety. Joke number 3 notes that even then, parents likely wished for a universal bell that signaled absolute silence the instant children left school.
Markets and shops begin to close for the day. Clerks sweep floors, lock doors, and arrange goods for morning displays. The mainstream fact is that retail schedules are tightly regulated by both custom and municipal expectations, creating predictable rhythms for both labor and consumer activity. Historians still argue whether structured closing times limit economic potential or simply stabilize social patterns, but you feel the orderliness of this routine as you move along.
You notice that public parks and leisure areas subtly empty. Children tire, couples return home, and bandstands fall silent. The mainstream fact is that public amusements are most active in daylight, and evenings become a transition period, bridging daily labor and nighttime routines. Historians still argue whether this transition truly supports relaxation or merely enforces social discipline, but standing in the fading light, you feel the deliberate calm of urban planning. Along a side street, you glimpse domestic activity. Women preparing simple dinners, families gathering around small tables, the quiet clatter of utensils and plates forming a rhythm of its own. Laundry is folded and stored, and minor repairs are completed before darkness settles fully. The mainstream fact is that domestic evening labor is relentless and continuous, often unpaid and unacknowledged. Historians still argue whether this labor empowers women within the household or confines them to invisible roles, but the effect is undeniable in shaping family life.
Finally, as dusk deepens, you pause to take in the city from a slightly elevated street. Chimneys puff faint smoke, wagons move with dimmed urgency, children's laughter fades, and the hum of evening settles over rooftops. Quirky tidbit: some families light small lanterns indoors to mark evening activities, a practice that also signals safety and presence to neighbors. You notice how subtle cues of light and motion guide life even when formal schedules end.
You feel the transition of the city's energy, from bustling labor and commerce to subtle domesticity and quiet leisure. The pulse is slower, softer, yet persistent. The mainstream fact is that evening routines in the Gilded Age define both family cohesion and social behavior, bridging workday demands and the promise of rest. Historians still argue whether urban evenings represent genuine respite or the quiet continuation of labor and social expectation. But walking through this softened world, you feel the rhythm as a living presence, a continuous flow carrying the city into night.
You notice the city has settled into a quieter hum, the streets now mostly emptied of their daytime bustle. Horse-drawn wagons move slowly, carrying the last deliveries of the day, and street vendors have packed away their goods, leaving faint traces of fruit scents and baked bread behind. The mainstream historical fact is that evening in the Gilded Age functions as a subtle transition, blending domestic routines, lingering labor, and the first hints of nightlife. You walk slowly, attuned to this new rhythm, aware of how the day folds into night.
Families gather in homes, rooms illuminated by gas lamps or flickering candles. Dinner is prepared or already consumed, the aroma of stew, bread, or roasted meats drifting into hallways and corridors. Children, now briefly free from school or errands, retreat to quiet play, reading, or the occasional mischievous experiment in mischief. Quirky tidbit: some families maintain informal story circles at this hour, reciting local legends or personal anecdotes, a tradition that predates the era of printed entertainment. Joke number 1 quietly observes that bedtime storytelling may have always been humanity's first slow media.
You pass windows where women wash dishes or fold laundry, their movements methodical and nearly hypnotic in repetition. The mainstream fact is that domestic labor continues into the evening for most households, with little regard for the hour. Historians still argue whether these routines offer structure and control, or simply extend work into what could otherwise be leisure time. But watching the choreography of these tasks, you see expertise and endurance entwined. Children's laughter fades as lanterns are lit. The soft glow reflects off polished surfaces, wooden floors, and brass fixtures, creating a comforting warmth. Quirky tidbit: some households carefully arrange lighting to enhance evening rituals, guiding children toward calm and adults toward reflection. Joke number 2 hums in the background, noting that humans have been managing circadian ambiance long before electricity.
In wealthier districts, salons and parlors host small gatherings. Music floats from a piano or violin, gentle and unobtrusive, blending with quiet conversation. The mainstream fact is that upper-class social life often peaks in the early evening, balancing display and intimacy. Historians still debate whether such gatherings foster genuine connection or primarily reinforce status hierarchies, but the effect on ambiance is undeniable.
You pass a bookstore with lamps glowing inside, patrons lingering to read or purchase, enjoying one of the few hours when the mind can wander after the demands of day labor. The mainstream fact is that literacy and access to print media continue to expand, offering both education and leisure. Quirky tidbit: some evening readers prefer candlelight to electric light, claiming it enhances concentration and imagination. Joke number 3 smiles at the thought of deliberate discomfort as a mark of sophistication.
Alongside homes, you notice alleys where children tuck themselves into final games, teaching each other lessons learned through day-long exploration. Adults supervise from doorways or upper windows, subtly enforcing rules while permitting autonomy. The mainstream fact is that informal play remains central to childhood development, even amid urban density. Historians still argue whether city spaces stifle or enhance creativity. But here, the joy is quiet yet palpable.
The city's noises soften to a gentle layering. Distant streetcars hum faintly, the occasional horse clop echoes off walls, and somewhere a piano note drifts up from a parlor window. You sense the collective exhale of a populace transitioning from day to evening, each household, shop, and street corner participating in an unspoken choreography. Quirky tidbit: some families coordinate evening routines with neighbors, from lighting lamps to meal timing, creating an invisible social rhythm. You feel the subtle intimacy of such coordination. You walk past a final stretch of markets and small shops, now shuttered for the night. The lingering sense of food and smoke mingle with the cooler evening air. The mainstream fact is that urban planning and commerce anticipates this daily closure, smoothing the shift from activity to rest. Historians still argue whether this predictability comforts or constrains urban residents, but in the quiet, you can sense the calm it provides. Finally, you reach a vantage point, overlooking rooftops, chimneys, and softly lit windows. The city stretches into the dusk, quiet but alive, each light a signal of domestic labor, leisure, or preparation for tomorrow. Your pace slows, your awareness of the layered rhythms, the public, the private, the industrial, and the domestic, settling into a meditative appreciation. The mainstream fact is that evening in the Gilded Age is both conclusion and preparation, linking one cycle of human activity to the next. You inhale the cool air, letting it fill your lungs as shadows deepen. Families retreat to bedrooms, servants finish tasks quietly, and even the city's animals settled into calm. Quirky tidbit: some households maintain small lanterns outdoors to mark entrances or guide late returns, a practice both practical and quietly ceremonial. You watch the faint glimmer of these lights, like tiny stars grounding the city in routine. Now, as the day's energies dissolve into night, you feel the soft rhythm of the Gilded Age settle into your own awareness, the labor, leisure, domesticity, and spectacle blending into an urban pulse. Joke number 4 whispers that even without modern entertainment or technology, people still found ways to structure time, satisfy curiosity, and seek comfort. You carry this subtle orchestration with you, the quiet resilience of human effort, observation, and adaptation echoing softly. The streets grow softer with each passing moment,
the noises of commerce, transport, and conversation fading into a gentle background hum. You imagine yourself walking more slowly, savoring each quiet sound, the distant creak of a cartwheel, the rustle of leaves stirred by a mild evening breeze, the faint laughter of children tucked into final games before bedtime. Your own breathing settles into this rhythm, in sync with the city's pulse, soft and unhurried. Windows glow faintly with domestic light, a signal of rest, reflection, or quiet creativity. You picture households preparing for sleep, chores completed, meals concluded, doors closed gently against the night air. The mainstream fact is that evenings anchor the day, providing both closure and preparation, a natural lull in the city's ongoing energy. Historians still argue whether this pattern fosters genuine respite or simply postpones labor, but in this gentle dusk, it feels restorative. You let the warmth of lamps, the hush of streets, and the delicate layering of human activity seep into your awareness. Quirky tidbit, even the simplest tasks, folding laundry, sweeping a stoop, or reading aloud, carry a rhythm that soothes both participant and observer. Each repeated motion, each soft sound, blends into a quiet cadence that makes the world feel contained, safe, and comforting. As your attention drifts with the evening, you feel the day's many layers: labor, play, leisure, domesticity, interweaving seamlessly. There is no rush, no clamor, only the gentle assurance of continuity. Your mind, like the city, begins to slow, the edges of consciousness softening. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan, or let the window stir a mild breeze, and allow yourself to sink fully into this calm, letting the Gilded Age cradle your imagination into a peaceful, restorative sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.